Hello and welcome. My name is Olga Hagova. I run our European Energy Security and Climate portfolio here at the Global Energy Center at the Atlantic Council. Thank you all for joining us here in person and to our virtual audience. First and foremost, I want to make sure that we recognize and send our heartfelt thoughts to the victims and the first responders and the family and the loved ones of the horrific aircraft incident that took place last night. It is a somber day in Washington, D.C. And thank you all for being here today with us and those who are joining us online. I'm really pleased to lead today's timely conversation. We mentioned that this is the best and the most challenging time to have this discussion around the transatlantic cooperation that is so much focused and so much based in energy trade and climate trade and supply chains, because there is still so much uncertainty, but things are moving fast and happening quickly. So this is also an opportune time for us to have this discussion. Just a couple of housekeeping items before we get started with our conversation. This conversation will be recorded online, is on the record. It will be available to view on our social media channels as well. And we will be taking questions towards the end of this discussion from online at askac.org. And also for the in-person audience, we do have some mics here that you would be able to line up behind towards the end to ask some of your questions, because we definitely want to make sure you have an opportunity to bring up some of your concerns and some of your ideas and some of your questions towards the end. It is my distinct honor to welcome a fantastic panel, a really wide, incredible variety of perspectives on these timely topics. We have Sean Fruley, who is the head of Economic and Trade and Finance Department at the Embassy of Germany. We have Tom Quadman, who is the Executive Vice President of the U.S. Chamber for Capital Markets Competitiveness and the Chamber Technology Engagement Center and the Global Innovation Policy Center. I think your title speaks for itself in terms of how important and timely these topics are. Of course, we also have Javier Sancho, who is the head of Global Issues and Innovation at the EU Delegation to the United States, the European External Action Service. And we have with us David Woodcock, who is a partner at Gibson, Dunn & Crutcher. So welcome to all of you, and thank you so much for being with us today. We'll start off with a very easy question, but a scene setter in terms of a broader overview of where would you say we are today in terms of the biggest divergences, but also biggest cohesion, alignment, cooperation in terms of our transatlantic trade. And I know we're focusing on energy and climate-related types of trades and cooperation, but let's take a pulse before we dive into some of these more gritty questions. Let's take a pulse of where you think, where you see the situation right now. Sean, let's start with you, if you don't mind.
Yeah, thank you very much, Olga, ladies and gentlemen. First of all, I would like to join you in your thoughts. Germany, the citizens of Germany are really, the thoughts are with the victims of this terrible accident, and that was really shocking news also in the German media. Olga, thank you very much for inviting me to this timely panel discussion. I mean, there's lots of discussions about the current challenges in the United States and in Germany, and I like very much your title about not a US strategy, not a European strategy, but really a transatlantic strategy. And this is, I believe, one of the key issues of today is transforming the answers we find towards some very important challenges, not in only, let's say, American answers or European answers, but really to find a new transatlantic agenda towards these challenges. And I would like to just to set the scene a little bit, to go into detail a little bit later. I see from a European perspective a triangle of three challenges with a stronger focus on energy, but you can, I mean, adapt that to different other areas as well, where we can see a lot of challenges, but where also we see lots of dots we can connect for common, a new transatlantic agenda and enhanced strategic partnership. So one part of this triangle is of course about security. So if we talk about energy, we could, I mean, have a focus on energy security here. But if we put that in a broader angle of security, it is also about security of supply chains, and the overall debate, how are we doing business, trade, cooperation in a geopolitical environment becoming more and more difficult, where threats by some states worldwide are becoming more and more clear. So, in my view, this energy security or the security area is one important part of this triangle. The other part of the triangle is, of course, this is the overall topic of this panel about innovation, competitiveness. And here, of course, from the European perspective, and yesterday there was an important new strategy also presented, but it's of course, from the European perspective, how we can implement and overcome the challenges outlined in the Draghi report. And here we can, of course, also find lots of potential transatlantic answers to these challenges. The third part of the triangle is, from a European perspective, still the challenge of decarbonization, which can be understood from different angles. But also when we take yesterday's strategy, it's quite clear that even if we the implementation might be modified and is open for discussion, the overall goal towards a world in which we have clean energy, from a German perspective, we would say green energy, because as you know, the German strategy is very much focusing on renewable energy. That's the decision we have made. But that we want a world, we want all live in a world where where natural disasters, living conditions are kept under control. So I would see here a third part of this triangle. And what we can see is that emphasis, when you talk about where are we standing and where is the evolution of the past years, that within that triangle, the emphasis is coming, came towards security due to geopolitical developments, but it came very clearly, and this is also what yesterday happened, that there is a raised awareness in Europe that we have also to give priority to enhance the competitiveness of our companies, and to transform this in a new transatlantic agenda. I think this is the task of the day.
Thank you so much for this comprehensive, and I love the 3 bullet points, very relevant. Tom, you have such a unique perspective in terms of interacting with US businesses, all sorts of sizes and focuses within the energy sector. Where are we at right now in terms of cooperation, engagement? Give us a quick kind of summary before we dive into what's coming up.
Sure. And thank you for those words, and I completely agree with you regarding the crash, but also thank you for convening us today, because I think this is a very timely, important topic and discussion we should be having today. I think there are a few things, right? One is there are strong historic ties between Europe and the United States. There are strong economic ties between Europe and the United States. You see some of that play out, right, with the Ukrainian war, where the United States was able to fill many of the energy needs, right, of that Europe was facing. The like-mindedness and values between the United States and Europe are important too. So with one of the issues I work on, or one of my teams work on, is AI. right? So we're looking at AI regulation. The reason why you see that talks along the G7 level, you see talks between the US and Europe, it's because of that like-mindedness. Where I do think there are some areas of divergence where we're in a very particularly precarious period right now, which I know we'll get into a little bit more. It's on the extraterritorial reach of regulations and where that conflicts with US law. But more importantly, what it endangers is that we've had a system where the European and the US regulators would get together, sort of come to an understanding of what information flows are coming through with disclosures. And the extraterritorial reach sort of sweeps that aside. And if we're going to do that in a couple of the topics we're going to talk about here, think about where that starts to go and what the American reaction to that could be. And that's something that we've, in our discussions with the Europeans, have been talking about for quite some time. Lastly, you've mentioned the Draghi report's already come up a few times. Look, the reason why growth for Europe is important, that's important for American businesses, right? We were having discussions with the Capital Markets Union 10 years ago for some of the very reasons that the Draghi report is talked about. But if we're going to have that regulatory divergence, or we're going to have a little bit of a tension around that, that's also going to, I think, imperil some of those efforts to deal with some of those growth issues.
Thank you so much. From the EU perspective, where are we today? How are things looking?
Well, like my fellow panelists here, of course, thank you for raising the tragedy. When we hear about a tragedy, it's always shocking, and when it is so close to us, it's even more unsettling when you think about a place that you know. So thank you very much, and of course, all our condolences to the families and friends. So what we heard today is a very good question, and like every good question, the answer is very complex because we don't know exactly. We have a very clear idea where we want to go, but the situation, politically speaking, is in a flux because things are happening as we speak. I will also say that the general context is that both the United States and the European Union are at the very beginning, the very, very earliest stages of a new political cycle. And that, of course, has direct impact on everything we are going to discuss here. We can dwell on the differences, the nuances that we had in the past, but I think that it will be more important to talk about the opportunities that this political juncture presents. And I think it's going to be difficult, it's going to be complex, of course. We are both very difficult and complex, but the difference between a difficulty and an opportunity is the attitude towards it. And I think that the fact that the political cycle, both political cycles are starting, it's a propitious time for that kind of discussion. And we are ready. We are completely ready. Now, the context in Europe, and I cannot speak about the United States, I can speak about the context in Europe, and I fully agree with the words of my fellow European panelists, but there are three priorities now: competitiveness, and competitiveness. It's not a buzzword. It's not a tactical move. It's a real strategy, because we have built, and we are very proud, a very impressive regulatory framework. And now is the time to implement it. And we have to be very pragmatic, precisely because we are very ambitious. Now, we are also absolutely determined. There is determination to continue our work towards decarbonization. It's very clear. We are like the postage stamp. We stick until we get there. We are going to do it, and we are going to stay the course. But at the same time, we need to be pragmatic, as I said before, about how we are going to implement this. And I will come back to that later on, but yesterday, you were referring to it, and also our German colleague, the Competitiveness Compass was published. And, the European Union policy-making machinery is extremely complex. I'm not going to impress you here because Washington is not bad either. But it takes a lot of time for 27 sovereign entities to get an agreement on anything. And we try very hard and we succeed that this agreement is not the lowest common denominator. We want to make progress. Very quickly after the elections and the beginning of the new commission and the new political cycle, things are happening. So we are not talking about things. We are going to do the things that we are talking about. The first one happened yesterday. I will come back to that with your permission afterwards, just to give a snapshot of what this is. One more thing. These issues that we are going to touch upon, we're going to discuss today, not long ago were technical matters discussed by experts, legal experts or economic, financial experts, energy experts. Now these issues lie at the very heart of geopolitics. So everything we do together with our American friends and allies has a geopolitical dimension. And we have, of course, to take that into account because we don't want unintended consequences. We just want to work together with like-minded partners. And the US is number one. Thank you.
Thank you, Javier. And we'll come back to you on some of the details around the competitiveness compass, and trust me, we will dive into that in a second. You mentioned the complexity of navigating this current situation and everything coming down the pipeline. Tom, this is something that you're thinking through, and David, from both the private sector and from the legal perspective. David, if you want to give us a quick kind of overview of where you think, what kind of questions are you getting from, the businesses here, maybe businesses that have investments here in the United States and Europe, or those who are considering, but maybe even starting off with just a quick overview of the CSRD and CSDD, even how the two are connected, how they two relate. There's a lot of acronyms, and it's just important to make sure we're all on the same page as we dive into the conversation of what exactly we're talking about here.
Great, thank you, and thank you for allowing me to join this great panel. Appreciate everything. And I would reiterate the words that people said. It's so close to us last night, the tragedy, so our prayers to them very seriously. So I guess I'll start with, I have to start with a bit of a story. What are people thinking? What are companies thinking? The United States is a place where the government is messy. There's a lot of debate. A lot of criticism is often that things don't happen here, right? It gets lost in debate, and so there can't be disagreement over lots of things. Take climate as one of them. The SEC proposed a climate rule. That took many years. It has been finalized. It is in litigation. It is uncertain how it will come out, but it is largely, almost completely, around disclosure of material, and we'll come back to that, I'm sure, material climate risk to a company. And it only applies to publicly traded companies, essentially. And it took years to get that. It's not clear where it will end up. It's been messy, lots of disagreement about what it should do, whether the SEC even has the authority to do it. Europe is, in my view, the EU in particular, is a contrast. Ambition, focus, and Europe regulates at a pace and a level, and with an expertise, I think, that we don't necessarily see here. And so when there is directed attention at something, they can produce, the Europeans can produce regulations at a volume and a clip and a specificity that you really don't see here. And I think, when thinking about sort of the CSDD, we'll get to some of what that means. But it's just a very big contrast between the two political systems. It's remarkable that with 27 different member states, they can come up with the really detailed and prescriptive policies, but those policies now, and I'll talk about the CSRD, this is the Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive. It's finalized, it's being implemented or being transposed and being put into place by member states. Companies have begun to comply with it in the US when they're caught up in its orbit. It is largely around the disclosure of material information, but with a caveat on materiality. Material information relating to ESG, environmental, social, and governance factors. Materiality under the CSRD is very, very different than it is in the United States. In the United States, you look to what a reasonable investor would believe would be important to a decision. In Europe, under the CSRD, it's called double materiality, and that looks from an inside out and an outside in. So, what's material to me as a company, and also what am I doing that might be material to people outside the company. A very different lens with which to look at it. The CSRDD is a complement, a companion to the CSRD. It is not. It has been. The directive has been finalized. It is being transposed by the member states, and they have to have that done, I believe, by 2026, and it'll be implemented for some companies that are caught up in it by 2027. Very, very different piece of a very, very different rule. It's the Corporate Sustainability Due Diligence Directive, and it is designed to impose due diligence requirements on companies relating to human rights and environmental issues that could have or may have adverse consequences. And it requires them to look at that diligence throughout their chain of activities. That includes their company, their suppliers, their subsidiaries, and their business partners. And it is very comprehensive. It was one of the most hotly debated pieces of, I call it legislation, in quite a while. And it will bring in companies who are required to comply with it directly, but also anyone who's caught up in the orbit of a company that is required to comply with it. If they're a supplier or a vendor, there are going to be requirements to comply with that. It also creates, I think, and we're with European experts, so you can correct me, but something I think is not quite as typical, and it creates a real liability regime that involves European enforcement, creating new agencies, right, that will enforce it at the member states. It also creates a liability regime, a civil liability regime, where companies can be sued by a whole host of potential stakeholders for failure to comply with it. And so that liability regime is really important. It creates notification requirements, whistleblower kind of requirements, complaint processes. So it's very, very comprehensive in those regards. And it also presents very large potential liability up to, I forget what it is, a very large percentage, 5% of annual turnover for the entire entity. Yes, fine, potential fine. So very, very substantial. And then lastly, it requires companies to have a climate transition plan that lays out how their business will be aligned with the Paris Accords, a 1.5 degree scenario. And that plan is, you can comply with that through the CSRD. They'll look to that as part of that. But that plan will be supervised, the creation end of that plan will be supervised by the European authorities. And then, so it is very comprehensive. It's unlike a lot of companies in the US, I think in some ways were caught a little flat-footed because they thought, well, this is just more disclosure. CSRD, we can do more disclosure. And I think what they're realizing is this requires a kind of a fundamental change to your business in terms of thinking about it. And I want to read really quickly the purpose of, at least part of the purpose of the directive. The directive is an important legislative tool to ensure corporate transition to a sustainable economy, including to reduce the existential harms and costs of climate change, to ensure alignment with global net zero by 2050, to avoid any misleading claims regarding such alignment, and to stop greenwashing, disinformation, and fossil fuels expansion worldwide in order to achieve international and European climate objectives. So it is very ambitious, and I'm sure we'll talk about it more here, but that's kind of an overview. Yeah.
I appreciate it. You did a fabulous job of summarizing something that can get very technical very quickly. There's a lot of additional details there too. Tom, let's go to you in terms of the response and what kind of calls are you getting from the U.S. companies? You mentioned, David, that it caught some companies by surprise. I would love to hear more about this. Have there been, letters sent in support and opposition, or maybe a bit of both? What are you hearing from the U.S. companies or in also European companies that have businesses in U.S. and in Europe?
Yeah, let me maybe give take a little bit of a step back, and then we can take a step forward on that. So let's say we're talking about climate, we're talking about human rights disclosures, right? So number one, David mentioned that the Biden administration, SEC, finished up a climate disclosure rule. Well, the SEC came out with guidance on climate disclosures in 2010. The vast majority of American public companies already do climate disclosures. The Jay Clayton SEC in 2020 came up with the human capital management rule, right, which we are still working through, how that is being implemented. So David is correct that I think a lot of companies were caught flat-footed when CSDDD was being finalized and what the implications of that were in terms of the supply chain. So let's just say our phone has been ringing off the hook. Even though we had been involved in discussions with European officials on these issues for many, many years, we formed a working group of companies in October. We have well over 100 companies that are involved in that. And there are a few reasons for this. Number one, let's just say at the outset, we agree human rights issues are very important issues. And to be frank, when an American company or a European company sets up shop in a foreign country, they're going to actually improve the standard of living, the economics, they're going to improve the liberties that those people and their workers are subject to. If anybody thinks a human rights disclosure is going to change the situation on the ground, let's talk about conflict minerals. And I can talk about that because I've been involved in that, because we actually did that under the Dodd-Frank Act. And I could show you stories from the New York Times and the Washington Post as recently as last week about how that has not improved the situation on the ground. But more important, now getting to some of the business issues here, as I alluded to, as we've been talking with the European Union about the need for equivalence on these regulations, which is normally what happens, right? What would happen is the American regulators and the European regulators get into the room and they say, okay, this is what the home country rules are. We're going to accept your information, you accept our information, we go our way, right? What has been happening with these rules when we go in and say there should be this equivalence discussion, whatever, so the American company is going to have to abide by American rules, the answer is no, because you don't have a double materiality standard, which, by the way, violates Supreme Court precedents, as David was saying, right? So furthermore, 90 years ago, as a matter of public policy, the United States made a decision under the FDR administration that private companies would not have to make disclosures. Well, CSDDD requires companies to make disclosures. When you talk about, if you have, $450 million in revenue in sales, and you can lose, be fined up to 5% of your global revenue, that's a wake-up call. Now you have to look at all those issues, right? And now take a look at, President Trump's remark during his Davos speech last week of non-economic barriers to American businesses in Europe. So that's why I was referencing we're sort of at a tipping point here of we've had a system that has worked well because this is how European accounting and audited financial statements are accepted by the SEC. But if we're going to start to go down this road, if there's going to be a divergence, we've already seen last year where the incoming Financial Services Committee chair said, you know what? Let me give you an example of how CSDDD could work, where there was a vote to unionize a plant in Alabama, that the workers voted not to unionize that plant, Mercedes-Benz, even though that was in full compliance with US labor law, both sides agree with that, the UAW filed a complaint with the German government under the German due diligence law. So we're not talking about Uyghurs, we're not talking about the Congo, we're going after a company that's operating in the United States with the highest transparency, highest worker laws, et cetera. So this is where you now see where the incoming administration, incoming Congress is looking askance at this and say, well, if we're going to do this to American companies, let's start to look at maybe what we could do with European companies. And to be frank, that's a loser for both sides. right? So that's why I think there's a chance here with the simplification agenda to right size this and get us back into balance.
Thank you so much. And I think what I'm hearing, yes, please go ahead.
No, there are so many references to the European Union that I think I should say a couple of words. But before that, I would like to refer to the fact that there is sometimes this idea that the European Union is a serial regulator, that we regulate for the sake of regulating, and that we are regulating the size of cucumbers, and therefore we are stifling innovation and going against the interests of businesses. That's a vision that, of course, we don't share at all, because we believe that regulation is not necessarily bad. We believe that regulation gives something to businesses that businesses need, which is certainty. And at the same time, it's an open process, as I said before, extremely complex process, but stakeholders are invited to participate in the process. But let me also add, there's a fundamental difference between the European Union and the United States when it comes to energy, for instance. And the fact is that we don't have, like you, the riches underground. We are importers. We don't have what you have. And you are exporters. There is an opportunity now because of the geopolitical dimension and the consequences of the war of aggression against Ukraine. And there is a very clear opportunity now to work together towards something which is mutually beneficial. And this is a good example. And what I believe is that the beginning of a new cycle here and the beginning of a new cycle there gives us that opportunity. So we can have never-ending discussions about the nuances. I'm sure that my colleagues in Brussels will have wonderful arguments just to wrestle with you. I'm not going to do that. But my point here is that basically the moment is now for meaningful discussions. You have interests to protect, and you do it very well. We also have interests to protect. We are not business, we are governments, we have citizens, we have policies, and we need to differentiate between politics and policy. What you're talking about and the nuances can be discussed in I would say, enriching conversations. But in the end, policy making is the key. What I'm saying is that there is a new political cycle, and therefore there is a new impetus and a readjustment of priorities in the way we are going to implement our regulations. So everything is perfectly open for discussion. Now, I would like to, because you kindly read a beautiful paragraph from, I would like to take the liberty of reading also a paragraph, because I think it's a good thing to do. The 8th of November, the heads of state and government of the European Union, so it's not a bunch of experts in a meeting room in the Berlaymont or the Charlemagne. This is actually heads of state and government together. They agreed upon, they adopted a declaration. And this declaration, in the paragraph 4, of course, they undertook to do certain things. And the paragraph that I wanted to read is very short, so bear with me. It says exactly, launching a simplification revolution, ensuring a clear, simple, and smart regulatory framework for businesses, and drastically reducing administrative, regulatory, and reporting burdens, in particular for SMEs. We must adopt an enabling mindset based on trust, allowing businesses to flourish without excessive regulation. Key objectives to be implemented by the Commission without delay include making concrete proposals on reducing reporting requirements by at least 25% in the first half of 2025, and including red tape and competitiveness impact assessments in its proposals. You can say it louder but not clearer. Now, what I was saying is that just yesterday, a few weeks after this was adopted, the Compass was published. That the new what's the name? The new economic industrial deal is going to be ready and public by the end of February. So we are taking swift action. The thing we need from our friends and colleagues is good conversations, meaningful conversations about what we can do together. And of course, we need to dwell on the nuances that we have. But I think that this is, at the political level, a very, very self-explanatory and clear message. Thank you.
Can I say I think that's
Yeah.
a great statement.
It's not me.
Well, even if it was you, it's still good. But it's a great statement, and I would encourage fast action, because as we sit here, companies, large multinationals who are thinking about this, they have to comply with some of these rules. And it isn't as though someone says, well, the rule kicks into place on the 2027. So great, in December of 2026, I'm going to start building a system to do this. There are systems being built. There are millions and millions of dollars being spent on data gathering systems, on setting up teams within companies. And so there's a tremendous amount of expense involved in complying, ensuring that you're complying, because Europe is a very important market. And so I would just say, having those conversations with the people who are engaging in that, trying to get ready for these regulations. If those regulations are going to change or at all around the edges, having those conversations earlier is much, much better, because it's happening now.
I cannot agree more.
And if I could just quickly point out, I agree with you, meaningful discussion is important, because some of the issues I'm raising in terms of regulatory splitting, right, we were raising that 3 years ago. And we were warning of there was going to come an administration at some point that was going to say, you know what, we don't like that extraterritorial reach. We can maybe react in our own way. So we've been raising these issues. I agree with you as well. The simplification agenda, I think, is an important step forward. I also agree it is an important step, particularly in the cycle that we're now in both sides in terms of leadership. But you now have American companies actually asking the question of, do I comply with the European law, as David has pointed out, which is expensive, it's expensive, you have to do the work on that, or do I run the risk of I'm going to run afoul of the Trump administration? And that's where the business community, the American business community is right now. And the other point is, which I think, again, just looking at it from that lens is, people are looking at it of, look at the market capitalization, right, of public companies, right? United States is 42% of the global public capital market capitalization. Europe is 8%. China is 8%. China's not exactly a transparent, right, system either. So I think we're at a very important point here, and these discussions have to happen quickly.
Yeah, I think, again, we cannot agree more. Yeah.
Good news.
No, I mean, I think this just showcases that the conversation is happening in real time.
Yeah.
And, opinions, concerns are being heard. It's just about, as you said, how quickly can we move on some of these areas. Jean, let's go back to you in terms of we heard the U.S. perspective questions on this side of the Atlantic. Could you walk us through on what we're hearing from Germany, even other countries? We've seen statements from France and others in terms of kind of some of the feedback on the implementation questions. Give us, for Germany being one of the major industrial hubs, and of course for, very relevant for energy prices, give us the perspective on how you're thinking through it, what you're hearing from the business community.
Thanks so much, and I'm also carefully listened to my colleagues here at the panel. So I would step one step back, because recall my introductory statement. So where we have these 3 dots, and you have competitiveness, but you also have security, which is an important element. And the CS triple D, I think, is one example where, of course, we have to converge different approaches into a common transatlantic approach. So in this particular example we are emphasizing here today, I mean, it's a regulation coming from the European Union, and so it's an issue for American companies. But I could also give you tons of examples where you have US regulation and there are European companies which have to take care of that. I mean, this also concerns extraterritorial effects of some regulations. So the European Union is not the only one doing that. And it also concerns security. I mean, when we talk about exports controls and all kinds of regulations, I also would like to remind here that concerning due diligence and also labor laws, human rights, it's not only the European Union which had these standards. We have these standards also in the US. So when I am a German company in Mexico or in the United States, I have to respect the US, the regulation lined out in the US MCA treaty. So I mean, it is obviously one important example, but we can see lots of others where, of course, devil is in the detail, especially in implementation, as you rightly laid out, and it's especially important, I think, to find transatlantic and common answers to that, to the implementation. My understanding is that there is a debate now in Brussels and among member states on the very concrete implementation of TS-Triple-D. So my expectation would be that there is discussion going on how we proceed further. Now, on the and this brings us back security, competitiveness. I mean, now on the overall intention of the 3S Triple D, I don't feel that everything there concerning the intentions is necessarily bad. To the contrary, I believe it is right that we look at supply chain. It is right that we take into consideration human rights in our understanding how we want to shape the world tomorrow. And yes, we were emphasizing on the climate provision, but it's also about how we protect the environment. And then, as I understand, also for the new administration here, for the Trump administration, health, environment is also an important topic. So we have also to be careful not to find ourselves after that, I mean, in debates. So I understand it's and the debate is there in Brussels. But when we talk about security of supply chains, when we talk about sustainability, so this is of course a comprehensive topic where, in my view, it is right that we include questions like human rights, because this is also part of a debate, how secure are our supply chains. Now, I fully agree, you can do bad things with good intentions. I mean, that's a main problem of humankind, is that you more do bad things with good intentions than you do good things with bad intentions. But the overall questions, in my view, remain. Security of supply chains, how we can make our societies better, but how we can also make, at the end of the day, the world a better place, a safer place. Yeah. It is also about security. So I deeply believe that the questions put on the table by these kind of regulations are not necessarily bad. Having said that, I believe that there is a huge task for the European Union and for the German economy. I mean, now coming from the German perspective, this is about red tape and deregulation. So there's a huge task and a huge debate now in Germany. I think it's also because of that direction that my Minister of Economy just welcomed very much yesterday's Compass, because it gave the clear direction towards more deregulation, which means, of course, less burden for the companies. So this is something where I think we will see lots of emphasis on that. We have to find common answers, and that's why I really appreciate that panel and the discussion.
There is a lot of common ground here. What I'm hearing, even from the lively, debate, we do share, similar goals in terms of human rights, environmental factors, competitiveness, supply chain, security was mentioned maybe 15 times already. But I think, where some of the divergence comes in is how do we get to those goals? There is a little bit of, different perspectives on how to get there. But I think overall, we're all trying to figure out from what I'm hearing from the US, from the EU perspective, getting there as cost competitively as possible, making it easy for the private sector to do the right thing, making it easier to showcase that the private sector is doing the right thing, and again, minimizing costs of getting to the objective, right? Because in the end of the day, the objective is not, as we mentioned, reporting and having a fancy statement and having, but the objective is getting to those hitting those targets, hitting those goals with the technologies that are available, that are realistic in a cost competitive way. So I think, let me know if I'm summarizing what I'm hearing correctly. But Javier, I want to go back to you because, we talked about the competitive compass coming out, and, this all kind of started officially with the conversations that have been going on for a while, but with Draghi's report that was published in terms of the importance of, creating a more unified market, more interconnected market. And of course, we're using CSDDD right now as an example of something that's really important, very relevant. But there's a broader conversation kind of in terms of how to navigate that, where you do have 27 different member states and how you mentioned this, all of you mentioned the implementation is key, devil's in the details, you said this. So kind of thinking through on how to ensure in what is EU's role in empowering member states to make sure that things are implemented in ways that are cohesive. So if you are a major US business, you're not coming in and trying to navigate 27 different national interpretations of, and we're using this CSDDD as an example, but any regulation out there, because there are some divergences that, again, make it challenging for businesses who do want to grow, they do want to invest on both sides.
Definitely. I would say that to a certain extent, and please, I'm not playing with words, but to a certain extent, the competitiveness compass is an executive order. It was very clear, and it gives marching orders that we need to, things we need to do quickly. I would also say that this is the first, probably a very important piece of document, of information, because it is the economic doctrine of the new Commission. Now, we will have the Clean Industrial Deal, and I think the name in itself is important and significant, end of February. And so things, as I was saying before, I know that by definition the private sector is more impatient, but by definition also the public, governments and the public sector, when they regulate, they need to take account of so many things. It takes some time. This is really, really very swift. Mm-hmm. And I remember being in conversations with friends about the taxonomy, the omnibus. And this is another thing that was announced around these days, actually. It was President von der Leyen, the President of the Commission, saying we are going to produce this omnibus. And it's about simplification. It's very, very complicated because you have directives and regulations. And in EU parlance, it's very different animals, but you need to put them together, due diligence, the reporting, but also taxonomy, which is, the point I wanted to make is this compass is very, very, very significant and consequential. Let me just give you the 5 very concrete policy areas or policies that we are going to start building in the very near future. The first one, as I said before, is to continue the Green Deal, to continue to decarbonize Europe, giving companies long-term predictability. The second is to reduce regulatory burden, the simplification shock, starting with the first omnibus that I was just referring to, coming very soon. We don't know what's going to be inside this thing. I think it will be a communication from the Commission, and I think it will be not big announcements about the specific pieces of regulation or legislation. It will be like to have a clear idea of the methodology, how we're going to get there. The third one will be financing. You referred to finances. We are creating new tools to finance, introducing a European savings and investments union to create new savings and new investment products. The fourth one is the single market, which is for us existential, and which is being built, is not finished. It's an unfinished project, but we are determined to continue building this, and we are ready to another revolutionary movement to shake the single market by introducing the 28th regime. Basically, the idea is to make it possible for the companies to benefit from a very clear, a single set of rules, let's say, wherever they invest and operate within the boundaries of the single market. And the fifth one, and I will stop here, is procurement, which is key for us as well. And the idea is to revise, to reassess public procurement rules, to introduce a European preference to prioritize critical sectors and technologies within the internal market. So, as the executive vice president of the Commission, who was announcing this with President von der Leyen yesterday, said, our success will be measured by four ambitions. The first one is to open more factories than we close. The second one is to produce more in Europe, made in Europe. The third one is to increase employment in Europe. And the fourth one, to increase the number of European unicorns. So you see, innovation is there, and competitiveness is the overall objective. Thank you. Sorry for being long.
No, it's a wonderful summary, and I really appreciate you kind of diving in and saying, like, here's exactly how this is being addressed. We're already getting a lot of really excellent questions here. I want to remind our audience here in person that you could line up behind the mic if you wanted to do a live question. But let me summarize a couple of questions that came through. We actually did a great job of addressing a lot of these questions already preemptively, but a couple of questions regarding third countries. So we are so hyper-focused right now on the U.S., Europe, EU relations and trade, which is of course very important, but also just interaction, supply chains. You talked about procurement with third countries, and there's at least two sides of the coin to this in terms of how U.S. and Europe cooperate around investments in third countries and other countries, right? But then there's also these supply chains around the world, and kind of how are we assessing those in terms of the existing regulations in U.S., in Europe, the alignment or disalignment there. And I think something that comes to mind that was already mentioned during this conversation is, of course, the critical minerals discussion in terms of how do we do a better job? How do we see more action on developing, robust, diversified critical mineral supply chains, together while we're navigating how to balance these diverging attitudes towards. So whoever wants to take that, and I see that we also have additional questions at the mic. So
maybe I can start, because I really believe that the point you mentioned is of crucial importance for a future transatlantic agenda. So it's one of 5 points I think are very important. So we'll come back maybe to the other 4 later, but we can resume what you have said under the overall concept of connectivity. So I think it is a major transatlantic task for the future to create corridors of friends, and thus enhancing the connectivity of the US and of Europe with the rest of the world. So we can see this this is a question for the Indo-Pacific. This is a question also when we talk about Africa and other supply chains, but I really believe that infrastructure and connectivity is key here. And of course, when we talk about these sectors like critical minerals, I think it's of utmost importance also that we keep in mind for future strategic agenda the opportunity of sectoral agreements between the US and Europe, and in which we can include also this outreach to other countries in the spirit of connectivity.
Can I add to that?
Go
Because
ahead.
I think you mentioned, John, a few minutes ago, the USMCA, and I think that's actually a good example of the difference, say, with the CSDDD versus USMCA, in the sense that I think as they're thinking about how do we do this now, how do we make this shift, engaging country to country, and I'm not saying it didn't happen, but more engaging country to country to figure out how to solve these problems. That's the first piece. But I would say a related piece is there's a concept in the US, it's discussed academically, called the stakeholder model of capitalism. And the stakeholder model is this sense that when you run a company, you should run it for all stakeholders. Set aside the practicality of that. In some ways, the CSDDD reflects that stakeholder model. And so in thinking about where might we make changes that improve innovation and competitiveness, I would think you'd want to bring in more stakeholders who reflect perhaps an industrial view. From my perspective, the CSDDD, you almost couldn't get a wish list better for people who are sort of anti-industrialist in terms of some of the requirements. So just thinking about that. And then the last piece of the unsolicited advice is thinking about maybe a more rigorous cost-benefit analysis. I'm not suggesting to go all the way to the US, which has a very rigorous cost-benefit analysis when it comes to rulemaking. It clogs things up all the time. Many rules are overturned because of it. But maybe thinking about a little more rigorous cost-benefit, and I know that was mentioned in the reports. And so those are three things that I think could help.
Just to build on that
Sure.
just a little bit. If you take a look at US securities laws, it's the material, when we talk about materiality, it's about the materiality decision of the shareholder or the potential investor, right? So understanding that American disclosures and American security regulations are going to be very particular to that and are going to be different, right? So there's going to be a difference between the US and the EU on that and the member states on that. What I would also say, and I agree with you, right? There are extraterritorial issues with the US, right? We actually opposed where the Obama administration was trying to have an extraterritorial reach on commodities regulations 10 years ago, longer, right? Which frankly would have made it more difficult to supply energy to Europe, right? So traditionally, we've had the regulatory bodies, we've had the government-to-government contact and agreement as to how the home countries were going to do what they were going to do and how the regulators were going to mutually recognize information. That I think we've all taken a bit of a step back from, and I think that's where we need to get back to. And I agree that the simplification agenda is a real thing. We were, some colleagues and myself, we were in Europe last month where we were having serious discussions on this. I actually have colleagues in Europe today on the ground that are having serious discussions on this. So I think there's a way to rebalance that where recognizing where the EU would like to go, but then also ensuring that American companies are dealing with, American law.
Thank you so much. We do have some questions at the mic, if you don't mind introducing yourself as well.
Hey, thank you. Tom Cunningham with Wilson Center. Good to see you, Olga. It's been too long. Great discussion. 3 questions, hopefully straightforward. One, a baseline question. What does that external materiality extend to? Does that extend beyond human stakeholders in Europe to, say, climate impacts in third regions? So one, the baseline question. Second, what specifically does this mean for European energy imports or energy imports? I can see how there could be an argument around relatively better carbon intensity from U.S. natural gas via LNG as opposed to the uncertain provenance of, say, Russian gas. But what does that mean for something that is intrinsically carbon intensive? And the last question is, given we're looking at a deregulatory administration agenda in the US and a continued regulatory progress in Europe, to the extent that these can be sort of subjectively interpreted in their application, these directives, to what extent can they be implemented as a rebuttal? Can they be used in, say, tariff wars, right? Can there be, how grave is that risk of escalation? And can that be used as a tool on the European side?
Thank you. Excellent questions. Who would like to go first to tackle those? David, Tom, Javier?
Look, I think when you look at American securities laws, and correct me if I'm wrong, David, but the concept of materiality is just with the shareholder or the potential investor, right? So that is really the only recognized stakeholder under American securities law. on the American side. It's different elsewhere, right? But American companies, that's the rule of law that they have to abide by. So that's why there's been some tension on some of these issues. But like I said, the SEC has a human capital management rule, right? So we already have something in place where investors and companies are going to get together and figure out what that level of disclosure is and what should be disclosed, right? To some of the other points you were raising, look, I do think, the threat of retaliation 5 years ago, I would have probably said I wasn't that worried about it. I'm actually quite worried about it, right? Because as I was mentioning earlier, we were actually raising the specter of this 3 years ago. And, just think of it this way, right? If an American regulator was to say, okay, American companies are dealing with these issues with CSDDD here, well, there are issues in Europe that we may not like in terms of their governance or their financial reporting, whatever else. European companies in the United States now have to abide by Sarbanes-Oxley. That's not a good place to be, right? Because I would argue that the home country regulation and then dealing with the cross-border issues, government to government, has worked well, and it's worked well on both sides. And I also think as well where Europe, I think, is really seriously trying to think through their growth issues, this is where we should be partnering with our strategic allies to ensure that they can grow, they can have that stability. And I think if we can get past these issues, we can deal with those more important things that I think are going to be more long-lasting and long-term.
Anyone else want to add to this?
I mean, the CSDDD, I'll speak directly about, is not a tariff, but the impact of it is very similar. It is raising the regulatory cost. It is designed to do so because if European companies have to abide by it, they are at a competitive disadvantage. And so that's one of the principal reasons to apply it extraterritorially as much as possible. So.
Thank you so much. Javier, did you want to
Just a word about energy security. You referred to the fact that, okay, how is it going to play out? You need energy, you need to import energy. And we are looking at every single detail. And we need energy. And we would like our energy to come from friends and allies. Norway is a great friend and is a great ally, and the US too. Now, don't forget that we are also the most, if not one of the most important markets for energy. So our American friends should look into that as well. But I think again and again, I'm sorry to be just repeating myself, but to approach what's going on now and what's going to happen with premises from the past is not a good idea. And again, as I said before, we should be able to distinguish between politics and policy. And at the same time, we are going to be just taking into account what is policy here and what are our interests. And I'm absolutely confident, I'm convinced that there will be enough room for us to find the commonality that we need to move forward quickly. You need to defend and to protect the interests of the American people and the American businesses. We need to protect also our businesses and our citizens. So let's talk, let's find a solution, let's move, let's deal.
Thank you so much. Look, we spent majority of this event, rightfully so, focusing on the regulatory cohesion, alignment, cooperation, making sure that these barriers don't get in the way. But this broader conversation is, about competitiveness, innovation, and there are other pillars too. Of course, the regulatory alignment being a huge, massive variable here. But what else should we be talking about in terms of kind of driving innovation, cooperation on that, driving development, driving economic growth? What else? What other factors? I know in Draghi report, yes, the regulatory alignment, that was a huge factor, but there were a lot of other pillars too. So I know we don't have too much time, and we'll go to an audience question afterwards. So thank you. But I would love to hear your thoughts on what else should we be talking about when we talk about transatlantic competitiveness and innovation.
Yeah, thank you so much. I see, as I already said, I see 5 areas as part of a new enhanced strategic partnership between Europe and the US, and these 5 points were outlined by your Atlantic Council colleagues, Jörn Fleck and Kosh Ara, in an excellent piece last week or 2 weeks ago. So, and they are outlining in detail 5 areas of opportunity in the transatlantic perspective. So the first area would be enhanced cooperation in the field of defense industries, security and defense industries. And it's going, again, along this triangle of security, competitiveness, and decarbonization. The second area they identify is energy, and I mean here the huge opportunity we have between Europe and the US in the field, for instance, of energy, LNG, but not only is obvious, and we have to make sure, of course, that everybody does his homework and that no barriers to this relationship exist. The third area would be, as I already mentioned, sectorial agreements in different fields, be it critical minerals, can be different sectors also in the field of trade, why not? And when I read the executive orders of the incoming presidents and also the trade memorandum, we have, I mean, this opportunity especially mentioned, the same way as the executive orders on energy mentions the interest of allies. So here I see, I mean, we have already this in writing that there is a huge interest from the new administration. The fourth area would be the area of new technologies, where we already can see, I mean, with a deep seek shock this week, that we need to find an answer to this challenge, not only artificial intelligence, but also a complicated area as well between Europe and the US. But the more it's complicated, the more we have to discuss in order to find a common approach. So artificial intelligence, quantum, chips, biotech, these are all areas of where there's huge opportunity. And the fifth area is about infrastructure and connectivity, where we have the reach out also to other regions, because indeed, as you rightly said, we cannot think transatlantic partnership only introverted, but we have to take into account the rest of the world, and to make the world better, and to make, to align with our friends and allies worldwide.
Tom, David, Javier, anything to add to?
A couple of things that I think, and I agree with everything you said. I think part of the other thing I would just add to that is the ability to attract investment is awfully important in order to deal with these growth issues. I think, what is it, the Savings and Investment Union is now what the old Capital Markets Union is being called. I mean, if you think about the US system, we're 80% non-bank. Europe is 20% non-bank. So really the ability to grow that pie is going to have to be done through building out a non-bank financial sector. And one of the differences, or one of the things I think the EU and the member states are going to have to take a serious look at, we take our federal bankruptcy code for granted. Goes back to the days of George Washington, right? The European Union is dealing with 27 different solvency codes. So the ability to come up with a single solvency code is one of the biggest differences that you could have. But you know, some of that depends on legal issues, some of that depends on cultural issues around risk, but that would be an important step forward.
Thank you.
I just want to second what you said about the importance of looking outside our bilateral relation, and what Jean said actually about connectivity. Just to mention, because there are people waiting there, sorry, just to mention that there is an opportunity also, because there are possibilities of synergies between our global gateway and PGI. That's another area in which we can really have very meaningful discussions about how to invest smartly with participation of the private sector in the so-called Global South.
Great, thank you so much. We'll go to the questions. Go ahead.
Hi.
Introduce yourself, please.
My name is Joseph Schneider, and many years ago, I was building a business, and we had a lot of work, Transatlantic, and I had an office in Paris and an office in Boston. Then we had a major disruption called the First Gulf War. So we had to restructure. In the US, everyone took a salary cut, et cetera. In Europe, I had no choice but to close the office because of labor regulations, et cetera. It was franc at the time, or Europe, for every euro I paid an employee that got into his hand, I had to pay €2 to the state for taxes and fees and things like that. So 2 years later, I ended up selling that company to the largest company in America. So we were able to rebound, et cetera. A couple of weeks ago, where you're sitting, Dan Yergin made the observation that the shale revolution in the US about 8 years ago has really changed the economics of energy in the world and has really changed the position in the US as now an energy supplier. And by implication, I would say the observation was that Europe is going to become far more dependent on the US for its energy in the future, as well as its security. As the Greeks observed, the strong do as they will, and the weak suffer as they must. As a person that was born in Europe, give me some hope that Europe can rebound, because all the indications that you read about is that Europe is falling way behind the growth areas of India and China and Vietnam, and that the growth is all in the East. The population is there. So I would like some hope that Europe can rebound, not just manage its decline and the decline of European civilization.
Thank you for your question. Reason to be optimistic.
Absolutely.
And we only have a few minutes left because I want to make sure we get to Ambassador Wells.
I'm an optimistic person, very sanguine also. And I just would like to draw your attention to what I was talking about, competitiveness being now not a buzzword, but actually the key strategic objective. We are not in denial. We know what's going on. And as I said, I mean, we are also a very important market for the US, but also for other players in the globe. We have global outreach, and we want to reach out globally. So we are not only responding, we are proactively doing it. But yes, I'm not in a position to give you personally hope, but I want to give myself hope, and I do every morning. And now that I see things moving forward, and I saw the capacity of the European Union to react to what was going on in Ukraine, that was geopolitical weight. And the energy crisis that we were handling was solved because of the transatlantic bond, because of the help of our friends from the United States of America. So there is hope. Of course there is hope, but not only hope. There is real optimism and an opportunity. Politics can be distracting. Statements, particularly when they are of an outlandish nature, can be distracting. I'm not talking about politics here, I can, but also, Olga, to invite a diplomat to talk about these issues when these issues are happening is quite risky. We can talk for a long time without saying anything. But my point is that competitiveness, this swift action being taken in Brussels, augurs well for what you are hoping.
Thank you so much. Ambassador Wells.
I was with ExxonMobil, and my company has expressed concern about the overregulation and the impact on our ability to invest in Europe. And so we certainly hope that the omnibus effort will produce meaningful reform. What I wanted to ask you is, what lessons have you drawn from the European Union's deforestation regulation, where you had more than 40 countries speak out against the impact of the regulation, including on supply chains? supply chains that include small and medium enterprises who are caught up in the same regulatory burden that the big multinational corporations are, who are targeted under CSDDD. And in particular, also the lesson of Germany, where you have BDI talking explicitly about the due diligence law causing them to shrink their supply chains, want to leave higher risk markets. And so if you're India, if you're Indonesia, or if you're an SME in Lubbock, Texas, what does this EU regulatory drive mean?
That was a very good question. The EU deforestation regulation is a complicated piece of legislation, and precisely because of the complexities and the intricacies of the text itself and the implementation, there was a decision to pause, and so that we have more time to explain what is it that we want to do, what is it that we want to achieve with it, and at the same time to have more time with our partners and friends and stakeholders in general to understand their needs and their requests. So thank you for your comment. And of course, now we have projects in the sense that we have devoted money, resources to explaining this. And but it's a good example of a piece of legislation that has a geopolitical dimension I was referring to before. We are open for discussion, and we are going to keep on talking about this with not only with the US, but also with Brazil and Indonesia, and with other partners around the world who might feel that they are going to be facing some difficulties because of the adoption and implementation of this particular regulation.
If I could put a plug in.
30 seconds.
I put a plug in for a lesson learned maybe. Because implementation of the CSDDD sort of systems and infrastructure and compliance is happening now, it might actually be a good time to pause that too, as well. But that's.
All right, Germany was called out if you wanted to add anything. All right. No, we have had.
Everything was said by my colleague.
Thank you.
No, I think this is a really great place to wrap up, and thank you for the excellent questions. We're just starting this conversation, right? I feel like this was such a rich discussion, and we haven't even fully dove into kind of the additional details and the next steps, and that things are changing by minute. And I know there's some big announcements, Omnibus and others, that will be coming out that will provide some more clarity. So this is an exciting time. Atlantic Council Global Energy Center will continue working on this area. We'll plan our trips to Brussels to come back and convene public and private conversations in DC to put out some, short, quick policy recommendations as well, based on the really brilliant ideas that we've heard today and things that we'll continue hearing in the next couple of weeks. But I just really want to thank our in-person audience, those of you who have joined us online. And of course, I want to thank our fantastic team that has made this possible. Haley Nelson, Alana Kiss, Katie Kenny, and of course, huge thanks to our Senior Director, Landon Darrence, for his leadership. This conversation is recorded and will be available on our social media platforms, on our website, and we look forward to seeing you at future events. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.